views and opinions expressed on this program are not necessarily those of Time Warner Cable.
Hello and welcome. My name is Dana Connors, and I'm pleased to welcome you back to the Bottom Line special that we have for you this month. In our first segment, we brought to you a conversation made possible by our annual meeting that was held in Bangor, in which John Harwood, a chief Washington correspondent, interacted with our 5 U.S. senators. A very unique opportunity to have them before us. Some would call it probably once in a lifetime. Well, tonight we're going to continue that conversation, and I hope you'll be as impressed and as appreciative as we are to have that representation. And by watching this show, you'll know why I said that. Enjoy.
And do you, by the way, given the fact that there's one way of looking at our economic situation and saying that we had a golden period after World War II when we dominated the world, and our GDP was a third of the world's GDP, and we had advantages no one else had, and including women coming into the workforce, labor productivity, all sorts of good things happening. And now the rest of the world's rising up to meet us, and we're just not going to get back to what we used to have. Do you think that's true?
No, I don't. The part I disagree with is about the rest of the world rising up. There is a myth, I believe it's a myth, that the United States is in decline at home and abroad. I think just the opposite is true. I think we are overwhelmingly dominant militarily. There hasn't been a third world war, and there's likely not to be one, primarily because of the overwhelming dominance of the American military power. Secondly, we have the moral high ground. We have a lot of problems in our country, and they've manifested themselves during this recent campaign. But we still are the most open, free, and just society in all of human history, the first and truest meritocracy in human history, and people look up to us around the world. So and one of the great strengths of democracy is that we discuss openly, vigorously, sometimes too much, our problems and our issues, and we tend to magnify the power of our rivals. Russia is in a state of terminal decline. It's a temporary thing they're going through now, but population, demographics, finances, too detailed to mention here, mean that when Putin first took office, he said his greatest fear was that for the first time in 300 years, Russia could slide into the second or third tier of nations. That's where they're heading. China has huge problems, far exceeding ours, most notably the absence of democracy, the rule of law, and an independent judiciary. We're going to be very dominant for as far into the future as human beings can see. And if we can solve our domestic issues, our economic problems, raise the standard of living, increase education and skill, I think our dominance will be even greater in the 21st century than it was in the 20th, because we are open to innovation, change. I want to make
okay, you got me feeling good now.
Yeah, well, let me make one point. You wouldn't know it by the news. We're in a technological revolution. 91%
Are you saying that my business is screwing some things up?
91% of all online searches in the world are conducted on American systems. 99% of all smartphones in the world operate on American-made operating systems. You can go down the list. 15 of the top 20 universities in the world are American. 9 of the top 10 business brands in the world are American. This notion of American decline is a myth. And people yearn around the world for strong and effective American leadership. And I think we're going to rise above our current problems if we can deal with these economic issues that we're embroiled in now.
Senator Snowe, I want to ask you another near-term politics question. I did an interview the other day with Senator Schumer, who is going to be the Democratic leader, perhaps the majority leader, about this very question I asked you guys. Are we in for a terrible slog for the next couple of years? And he said, no. He said, the Republicans are going to do business with us. And I said, what is the evidence for that? And he said, here's what happened. 2010 and 2012, Tea Party was on the march. We were coming out of the Great Recession. Senator Mitchell talked about economic forces. People were high state of agitation, and the Republican incumbents were back on their heels. Some were losing their primaries. Now, 2014, 2016, they're winning their primaries, and they're going to come out of this election and say, enough, I want to get stuff done, and I'm going to cooperate with Chuck Schumer and Hillary Clinton. Is that realistic?
Well, certainly, I think obviously it depends on the basis on which they've won. I mean, as you're focusing on the primary, and Senator Schumer's focusing on the primaries, and that's been true. I mean, I think we know from the polarization that's occurred in America that has divided America. Now, I think, frankly, we should jettison the red and blue maps because it's so divisive in focusing on red states and blue states, and more importantly is to focus on the United States. And so the incentive has been on the primaries. And that's why you've seen, you know, either amendments and positions, and certainly when I was in the Senate, and I'm sure Susan would agree, we're all positioned for the ideological base. If there's one thing that changed, was everything was reoriented towards the base of the political parties. And I remember one time I was on the floor of the Senate at the table where each side has, where you have a description of the vote being considered, and that's always interesting because the discrepancy in those descriptions, you'd hardly recognize you were voting on the same issue. But in any event, I was wondering why we're having this vote. And a member of my leadership said, well, this one's for the base. And I said, well, how many votes do we have to have for the base? And that was true on both sides. We're casting those votes for the base, and we have to move away from that, and hopefully that will be the case. Because we really have to support those individuals who are willing to work across the aisle. The late Senator Warren Rudman, who was a former colleague of George and Bill's and a friend, said, politics is too important to be left to the politician. And he's so right. It is up to all of us to change the dynamic and the orientation, because that's what matters in America. I'm certainly hopeful, because I know we can change it if we all do it and weigh in. And that's what needs to happen, certainly in the United States Congress, to achieve the things that George was just referring to, on the economic issues that matter profoundly to Americans. When I was describing a scenario based on a Main Street tour that I took here in Maine back in 2010, which I'd like to do, and we had a hearing, and the Secretary of Treasury was before the committee, and I described, what I saw, for the economy, that it wasn't working for the communities in my state. And he said, oh, you're describing something very dark and pessimistic. I don't agree with you. Well, that was 6 years ago, and here we are. We're at 2% growth. That's not good enough for America, frankly. We can do better with the investments that George is referring to and Susan's talking about for an agenda, and we have to focus on that. People often ask me, is it really that different from the past? And I said, well, yeah, it's as different as night from day, in the sense that what distinguished us from the past is that in the past we were willing, after the fierce debates, and many of them were unpleasant, that we were able to transcend our differences for the greater good of the country and reach a solution. Today, it's all about taking it to the next election and, scoring political points, the all or nothing proposition. So it doesn't become legislating anymore. It's all about, campaigns. And so it becomes perpetual. We used to, and George and Bill can attest to this, when we first, I was in the House and they're in the Senate, is that at least in the first year you could devote your time to a legislative agenda, knowing that in the second year politics would interfere. So hopefully, when you have people like Susan and Angus who are there, we have to support them. We have to speak up and support those who are willing to take the risk of working with each other instead of against each other. And somebody once said, bipartisanship is not a political theory. It is a political necessity.
Senator Collins, do you think that they're more jealous of you for still being in, or you're more jealous of them for being out?
I think that all three of my colleagues did such fabulous jobs representing the state of Maine. that I, for one, am very pleased to try to follow in their footsteps. I remain, to answer your question about Senator Schumer and if it is President Clinton, there's a real incentive for the Democrats to cooperate because this cycle, there are far more Republicans who, as you know, are up for re-election. It is the reverse 2 years from now. And they are going to want to be able to point to a list of accomplishments. And I think that creates an opening, an opportunity for us to come together and get something done. But I want to piggyback on something that Olympia said, and that is that those of us who do cross the aisle and work together to try to really solve problems need the support of the American people. If in primaries the activists tend to be from the far left in the Democratic Party and the far right in the Republican Party, it makes it very difficult for those who are in the middle, particularly since independents can't vote in primaries for the most part. So I believe that the center in America needs to wake up and be more active and not lead the political decisions to the extremes.
Senator King, we've been talking about what doesn't work, and of course the entire campaign's been focused on what doesn't work in Washington, and that's fairly evident. You've been in the Senate now 3 years, 4 years? Tell me a story about something where you found that it did work, where you saw a problem, you were able to work with colleagues of the other party, and achieve a success that you were proud of.
A perfect example of that was I'd been there about 6 months, and one of the things that surprised me, the sequester hit in March of my first year. And everybody in the place was wringing their hands and saying how terrible it was. And the Democrats had a plan. They were in the majority then. They put it on the floor. It failed. The Republicans had a plan. It went on the floor. It failed. And at that point, I said, well, this is where Mitch and Harry make a deal. And it didn't happen. Everybody just moved on to the next issue, which really shocked me. One of my theories is that the Senate, here's an interesting fact, 65 of the 100 senators have been there 8 years or less. And what that means is 2/3 of the Senate has never seen it work. They're like a high school football team that's lost every game for 5 years. We don't know how to win. And so subsequent to that sequester debacle, there came the law was that student loan rates were going to double in the summer of 2013. The same thing happened. The Democrats had a plan. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders didn't get the votes. The Republicans had a plan, didn't get the votes. Joe Manchin and I, he's a very conservative Democratic senator from West Virginia, said, this is dumb. There's got to be a solution. This is just arithmetic. Come on. So we started talking to Richard Burr, who's a Republican senator from North Carolina, Tom Coburn, very Republican senator from Oklahoma, and Lamar Alexander, who's one of the giants of the Senate in my estimation, and then Tom Carper and a couple of Dick Durbin, and there were 4 or 5 of us, and we got together and hammered out a compromise on student loans. And Durbin got the president, and the president, we had this kabuki meeting at the White House where, I thought, oh, this is going to be a great discussion with the president. It was actually a setup for the president to tell Tom Harkin, the chairman of the committee and a very liberal guy, you got to take this deal. And Harkin said, oh yeah, okay, and he took the deal. It ended up passing both houses, signed by the president, and I just saw something a couple of weeks ago. That change, which had the effect of cutting student loan rates in half, has saved American students $50 billion. So that was a case where just a small group said, this is dumb, there's got to be a way to solve this problem. Now that was a fairly distinct, narrow problem. You talk about immigration or the whole budget, it becomes much more complex. But it can be done, and I think it's important to note, Congress doesn't do well on the big issues right now, no doubt about it, immigration or guns or budgets, but there is a level of education reform, workforce reform, VA reform. All of those passed by strong 70, 80 bipartisan votes. They all went through the House, they all went to the president. So that doesn't get the press. I'm still waiting for the headline that says 8,500 airplanes landed safely yesterday. You know, you never see that. So that was a case where I felt there was a contribution to be made from the center, and those things can happen. I want to ask Bill Cohen a question about the structure. No,
Go ahead, take your job.
No, I want to ask Bill and George, because I'm genuinely curious.
Don, in case you didn't know it,
Remember he
When you guys were there, did you have, Bill, when you guys were there, did you have a partisan lunch every day of the week?
We had a partisan lunch once a week.
Yeah, now it's every day of the week for both parties. That's one of the problems.
Wait, I thought it was only on Tuesdays.
No, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And the Senate prayer breakfast on Wednesday morning is the only bipartisan event of the week. I mean, I think there's some structural problems that are keeping us from getting
Well,
it.
let me follow up on one thing you said before. You said you were expecting Harry and Mitch to make a deal. The fact that they didn't make a deal, is that about Harry and Mitch and their toxic relationship, or is that about structural forces that are much bigger than Harry and Mitch?
I think it's a little of both, and I'd be interested in Susan's view on it.
I'd be interested in not commenting on that.
I don't,
Okay, well, Senator Mitchell can comment on that.
it's no secret that they don't like each other, and they didn't trust each other, and it was very difficult for them to work together. I mean,
But okay, Senator Mitchell, let's put it to you. Is that personal relationship really important? Or are the partisan alignments so fixed and stable that it doesn't really matter if it's Schumer or Cornyn or Mitch?
I think the personal relationship is important. The reality is, of course, that in a very large, diverse country like ours, having only two political parties means that each party is itself a broad coalition of a diverse set of interests, economic and geographic. So within each of the so-called caucuses, the Senate Republicans in one, Senate Democrats in the other, it's not a uniform group. There are widely divergent views within the caucus. And I think if the leader doesn't have any trust and confidence in the word of the other leader, that he then is really a hostage to the most extreme elements within his own caucus, someday soon, hopefully, her caucus. And
In other words, if he has that trust and confidence, he can maneuver more.
that's exactly right. That's it. Look, let's face the reality. I got as much flack from Democratic senators when I was a majority leader, maybe more than I did from Republican senators. And many of them said to me often, oh, you're just a patsy for Dole. You agree to everything he wants. You compromise with what he wants. And Dole would get the same thing from his caucus. I think he got more than I did because I think their caucus was more decisively one way, and they had some internal problems.
For the record, were you a patsy for Dole?
We got things done, so it doesn't make any difference. What matters was the result. Sure, I did. I tried very, very hard never to embarrass him, never to criticize him publicly, and always to leave him an out and an opening in case his view didn't prevail.
And you didn't go to Kansas to campaign against him when he was up for
I
re-election?
did not go to Kansas. I've set foot in Kansas only a few times in my life, and the purpose has been to praise Bob Dole.
Can I raise
Yeah.
a point of order? I think the junior
Point of
senators had
order.
much too much time allotted.
Yeah.
I mean, some deference has to be shown to seniority here.
Well, okay, Mr. Secretary, let me do it this way.
Oh, it's okay. Go ahead and ask him a question.
He told a story in the green room about you throwing your weight around as the senior guy on veterans, military defense issues, and sort of crowding him out of a speech he wanted to give at a ship opening. That's true. I know that the relationships among colleagues in the Senate of the same state is often kind of difficult. What's the worst thing he ever did to you when you guys were
Become majority leader. Took away my prime position to go first on each and every occasion. I'd like to say just a couple of points in terms of what's being discussed here. I don't think that the two leaders can really be in a position to make deals unless you have leadership coming from the White House. I think who is in the White House sets a tone, and if it's going to be a Hillary Clinton, do I think that she'd be more likely to try to urge the parties to work together? I think the answer is yes, just by virtue of having been a U.S. Senator, having served as a spouse to the President of the United States, who was interested in trying to put together coalitions to make things work. I think if Donald Trump gets elected, I think it's going to be more difficult, because he said members of the Senate are corrupt, or stupid, or incompetent. And so he has already set a tone against the Senate and members of Congress that he's going to have a much different agenda. So it's going to be more difficult, I think, for the leaders then, under those circumstances, to get together. It's just a personal opinion on this, and it may be not shared by anyone else. Secondly, there's the issue of we haven't talked a word about foreign policy and how that impacts our national security, our economic security. And people around the world, notwithstanding what George has mentioned, and it's true, we're still the best deal on the planet. Everybody still wants to invest here because of the rule of law, as opposed to the law of rule. But other countries are really getting concerned about us. They see us as pulling back and disengaging. Now think about this. We had to pass, or you had to pass, Susan and Angus, a budget with a $3.2 or $3 billion, the European Reassurance Initiative. We had to pass over $3 billion to reassure our European allies that we're with them, that we haven't abandoned our commitment to Europe and to its security. So you look at that, you look at what's taking place in the Middle East, we're seen as pulling back. And then you turn and look at the Asia-Pacific region. It's an economic powerhouse in that region. That's China. India is coming up behind it, and it will take some time, but China is going to pose a significant threat in the sense of competition, certainly economically and ultimately militarily at some point. So other countries watch us. We haven't talked about Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has been dismissed by virtually everybody in office, except it has a national security dimension to it. It's not just the economic arrangement that you have 12 countries who've agreed with the 11 other countries with the United States to have this Trans-Pacific Partnership in terms of lowering tariff barriers and regulations. They see it as part also of the United States being in the lead in writing the economic rules for that part of the world. And what we have seen is President Obama said, you know, we want to go forward with this, and Congress is saying, no, it's out of the question. So virtually every one of the Asia-Pacific countries now look at us and say, wait a minute, if you don't write the rules, guess who's going to write the rules? And is this in your interest? And the answer is no. And yet, most of the American people see this, well, it's a trade agreement, trade is bad. It's not that trade has been bad for our workers. Technology has also had its major role, namely that, as George was talking about the Industrial Revolution, machines started replacing labor. Well, technology is replacing labor. And so we've got to think about ways in which we stay engaged in world affairs, economically, diplomatically, and militarily. And I would not challenge the issue at all. I agree with Senator Mitchell George, my junior colleague. We have the best in the world, and everyone here, Angus, you're in the armed services, Susan, you were there, Olympia, we have the best military in the world. But we do stupid things in terms of passing sequesters, which means across-the-board cuts. That has been devastating in terms of trying to plan for anything in the future. And if I had one message that we need to come to grips with is we have to have a budget. You can't continue to run our government on a continuing resolution. Right now, the funding is good until when? December? And then there's no budget. How do you, in the military or as a military contractor, building aircraft or submarines or naval ships, how do they plan? And how does the military plan when there's no budget?
And we've gotten to a point where passing a continuing resolution is considered a big success.
Right. So these are things that we need to do, and we have to really begin at home. We can't really be strong abroad unless we're strong at home, and other countries look to us. I can verify this to you. They look to us and say, I go there and I say, I want you to be like Mike. And they say, we don't want to be like Mike, because Mike can't make a decision. Mike is not making decisions. You are paralyzed into inaction when it comes to the big issues, and we're not facing the big issues. So I think it takes a combination, strong leadership at the top, allowing the members, the leaders of our two parties at that point to have more room to negotiate and come, and sort of like the marriage moving, as Frost said, moving easy in harness. You've got to have the harness.
That has been our special bottom line program for you this month. We've had a tremendous pride in having the event, sponsoring the event, and sharing it with you as well. As one person said as they left the building that night, that's the way it was, and that's the way it should be. Again, I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have enjoyed bringing it to you. Our special holiday gift to all of you from all of us here at the State Chamber is that we hope this holiday is everything you want it to be, and that you have the opportunity to celebrate it with the ones that mean the most to you. Thank you, and good day.
The views and opinions expressed on this program are not necessarily those of Time Warner Cable.
Hello and welcome to The Bottom Line. My name is Dana Connors, and I'm pleased to be the host of this monthly program brought to you by the Maine State Chamber of Commerce. Today, this month, we have a Bottom Line special for you. It's a two-part series. Actually, we bring it to you with a tremendous amount of pride. Actually, we are sharing with you our annual meeting. It was an extraordinary event that took place at the Cross Insurance Center in Bangor on October 28th. It was special because we had the unique opportunity of sharing time at the same place, the same time, on the same stage with our 5 living U.S. senators. It was, as I said, an extraordinary evening. We had the help of our moderator, John Harwood, who is a respected journalist and chief Washington correspondent for CNBC News. And he was able to bring to life an entertaining and insightful evening by way of our 5 senators. That, of course, would be Cohen, Mitchell, Snowe, Collins, and King. We shared their experience. We shared by their example, by their skill and excellence, a reminder that Maine is extremely fortunate to have the service, the standing, the respect, and the excellence of all 5 of those people representing us. And we were reassured at the same time that you can reach across the political divide. You can work with others with diverse opinions to get the job done. It was a night of pride for us, a tremendous, fantastic evening to share the time with our 5 senators. Now we'd like to share it with you as well.
But when Senator Cohen left the Senate, he gave a set of remarks in which he lamented things that were not going well in our politics. Inflammatory rhetoric, divisive, crazy people on the radio and television, making things worse, um, instant polls, reacting to polls, people behaving in extreme and inflammatory ways. And he concluded by saying the center has to hold, because if the center doesn't hold, we're going to have gridlock, we're going to have paralysis, we're going to have government shutdowns, and the cynicism is going to cripple the functioning of our government for generations. Okay, that was an entire generation ago. That was 20 years ago. And every single one of the things that he described, I would say, has gotten worse during that time.
It has.
And so I guess what I would start, since all of you have credibility on this issue, but I want to start with you, do you any longer believe that the center can hold? Is that a lost cause? And if it can, how does that happen?
I think in the short term, the center is not going to hold, but I think in the long term it has to. Otherwise, I was actually quoting Yeats in terms of the second coming, and that things fall apart when the center can no longer hold. And the worst are full of passion and intensity, while the best are lacking in all conviction. You have that same sentiment today, and I would say there are three things in my mind that are the cause of the, I would say, intensification of the mood. One is globalization, the second is immigration, and the third is the democratization of information. If you take those three phenomena and all of the consequences that flow from those three things, then you can see that there has been a tremendous shift in terms of job opportunity, in terms of sense of identity, in terms of America being number one, when you see the playing field start to level out because now everyone has access to information. So we could spend the evening talking about it, but I think those three factors are at the heart of what is pulling us apart right now and pulling us to extremes, both in the Republican Party and in the Democratic Party.
But when you say in the long term it has to, okay, show me the scenario where that actually happens. Like what changes the trajectory that we're now on?
Well, I think we'll see the breakup of the two parties in the sense that there'll be the more extreme right wing, the Breitbart folks and Donald Trump. They will try, I think, to embrace the GOP, but I think the Republican Party will resist that, the Paul Ryans and others. So we're likely to see two versions of the GOP at least, or one Breitbart, one GOP. Then you'll have the Angus King kind of centrist, and then you'll have the Senator Snowe and Senator Collins, who represent the moderate Republicans who will drift closer to the independents, and then you'll have the Democratic Party left. Now, how does this all come back together? I think that once people see that the fracturing and the breakup of this two-party system, in which there's a big tent for both parties, they'll have to come back to that. Otherwise, they will see what the consequences are for us domestically, internationally, where we are unable to make decisions, and therefore our futures will be even further receding for our kids.
So before I ask the others to talk about this, let me just get a quick show of hands. How many of you actually agree with Senator Cohen that we are staring in the face of the breakup of the parties as we've known them? Raise your hand if you think we are. Okay, just one. Okay. All right, tell me why.
I think the elements that Bill has described can be referred to as the revolution through which we are now passing in the world. Technology, the changes in commerce across national borders, the movement of people across borders. It's very common in human affairs to have uncertainty, fear, anxiety, upheaval, and violence in such revolutions. The Industrial Revolution began 250 years ago in England, and you had an almost identical situation. Machines replaced men, and there was widespread fear of high unemployment. So there was fear, there was anxiety, there was demagoguery, there was violence. But over the course of the several decades in which the revolution played out, productivity rose so dramatically that there was a general rise in the standard of living of the entire society. And the politics then sorted itself out. I believe the greatest challenge we face as a country now is to figure out a way to harness the benefits from the revolution through which we are passing, from which most of the people in this room benefit, and everybody on this stage benefits. But there are tens of millions of our fellow Americans who are victims of this revolution, not beneficiaries. We've had a spectacular increase in the amount of wealth created in the world, but increasingly worldwide and in America, it is concentrated in a relatively few hands and not distributed throughout the whole society. And that's the fear and anxiety that's now being expressed in the Borden campaign. I believe what will change it is for we to devise effective policies that don't take us backward in time, don't build walls, continue to harness the great benefits from technological change and increased trade, but see to it that they are distributed throughout the whole society in the form of education and skill so that everyone feels that they're benefiting. And when you get a rising standard of living for everyone, then I think the politics sorts itself out. I think Bill is right in terms of some degree of political alignment, particularly within the Republican Party, depending on what happens in the election, who wins, who loses, by what margin, what consequences come from it. But I think in the end, the politics will follow what happens in this larger society. And meeting the demand of equal opportunity for all Americans is the greatest challenge that we face. I think we're up to it. We've encountered and overcome many greater challenges in the past, but one of the most disappointing parts of the recent campaign is it hasn't even been addressed. Maybe you can't do it in presidential campaigns because there it's slogans and inflammatory statements and catchy phrases. But a serious national debate has to occur on how do we adjust to this, not by going backward, but by going forward in a way that distributes education, opportunity, skill throughout the whole society.
Senator Snowe?
Yes. Well, I don't disagree with Bill in the sense that there is certainly change occurring, within the political parties, and most certainly, within the Republican Party, and I think much of which has occurred due to the political realignment, where Republicans are now more dominant in the South and the West, and we've lost a lot of our moderate centrist support in the Northeast and the Midwest. It's now more, where the Democrats predominate. So you're seeing that change that's been underway and certainly manifested itself.
There's no reversing that change, right?
Well, there's no reversing that change. But I think...
for a big chunk of the last few years, you guys were the entire moderate caucus of the Republican Party.
Yeah, I was, that's exactly right. I was described as a dinosaur. In fact, there was a New York Times cartoonist who showed me in a museum as part of an extinct species.
Was it a good likeness?
Huh? Well, not quite. I would have done a little bit better on that one. But I always said, and I'm sure Susan feels the same, I felt like a cast member on Survivor, giving many obstacles to overcome. Not sure I was welcomed as a member of the organization. But what has really changed and what contributed to my departure? Because it was obviously a very difficult decision. But I came to that realization that the polarization was not going to diminish in the short term. And when Bill refers to the center, absolutely right. You need a center. I describe it as a sensible center. Tried to build that. Susan has, within the Republican Party. Jock has, my husband, the governor. I mean, because it is important. It's also important in the American political system as well, and in the United States Congress. And what we were doing is neglecting the major issues that are so consequential to the average American that George just spoke to. And there's a major detachment between those who are governed and those who are being governed. And, as I travel across the country, I hear people's fears, that this current culture is going to become part, and become more permanent, institutionalized, and that we will not be able to change it. And that's why when I left the Senate, I thought it was important to concentrate on those elements where we could change it. Because I think it's so important that we support, senators like Susan, like Angus, reinforce what they're attempting to do working across the aisle and restoring the normalcy to the legislative process for the rank and file to get more involved in drafting the legislation, having a stake in the outcome, because that's not happening. The essence of public service is solving problems. That's what I learned in my first days in the state legislature. And, and it's from that premise that we have to work and to support those individuals who are willing to work across the aisle.
Senator Collins, I want to ask you from this perspective. So we're hearing a little bit of, well, in the long term, things will get better for, if we're able to distribute economic gains more widely, or people get, the political puzzle pieces move around and resettle, and then we have a center. But talk about the next couple of years, because what you hear now, we're a couple weeks from the election, what you hear now is people talking about endless investigation. Assume Hillary Clinton wins, she's leading in the polls. Endless investigations, no Supreme Court picks, Freedom Caucus talking about firing Paul Ryan as the House Speaker. Is it as bleak as that sounds?
I'm going to give a more optimistic view than my colleagues. Otherwise, Angus and I can't bear to stay in the Senate, right? But I really believe that there is an opportunity here. Certainly, the forces that have been described make it more difficult for those of us who are in the center, and they're exacerbated by gerrymandering in the House, by the 24/7 news cycle, by people only getting their news from outlets that reinforce what they already believe. But Angus and I have seen the center work. In 2013, when government shut down, which was a tremendous failure by all who were in public office, I went to the Senate floor and outlined a plan for reopening government. And I put together a group of 7 Republicans, 6 Democrats, and Angus, and we met night and day to hammer out a framework that led to the reopening of government. So there are those in the Senate who very much want government to work. And the reason that I'm optimistic, and Angus and I were just talking about this earlier, is the members of that group, which I dubbed the Common Sense Coalition, have all come up to me and said, we need to get together and look ahead at the new Congress. And our next president, whoever she or he may be, has an opportunity to select issues that are bipartisan in nature and chalk up some wins for the American people, and I would suggest 3. One is to concentrate on increasing biomedical research. That affects every American family. The Republican Congress has been leading the way in increasing the budget for the National Institutes of Health, and it matters to everybody, and it's a totally bipartisan issue. Second would be an initiative to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure. It's not just in Maine, it's all across the country. And third is to tackle our tax code, to really embrace tax reform and the goals of a simpler, fairer, more pro-growth tax system. I think if our next president put out a platform to address those 3 issues right up front, that there would be bipartisan support for doing so.
I just want to ask you one thing about the Senate versus the House. The Senate is not the House. It's more like the House than it used to be, but it's not the House. It's easier to do what you're describing in the Senate. Can it happen in the House when you have a a caucus, majority caucus, that half the time is threatening to depose the speaker.
I never served in the House, so maybe Olympia or Bill would be better able to address that. But I think it can happen. I believe that if the next president actually reaches out in a bipartisan way to the members of the House and the Senate. George Bush used to have the joint leadership over to breakfast once a week, and President Obama has not done that. I think he would have been better served to have done that. And it's hard to demonize someone you've broken bread with. If an agenda that has bipartisan support were put out there that the public would support, there would be pressure on both parties to do what Olympia said, start solving problems and stop focusing on scoring partisan political points.
Senator King, you are an independent. You caucus with the Democrats, you vote like a Democrat, but nevertheless you keep a distance from that party and, of course, obviously from the Republicans. Why is that an important part of your political identity?
Because I see myself as having an opportunity to be a bridge builder. And I'm trying.
Do your colleagues see you that way, or do they see you as a Democrat with a different name,
well,
like
I think
Bernie Sanders?
if you would judge it by being viewed with some level of distrust by both sides,
Yes.
the answer is yes. But I want to go back to something that Bill said at the beginning. We're talking about division and polarization in the Congress. The reality is that our political system reflects the public, and the public is polarized and divided. And one of the points that Bill made that I think is very important is what I call the balkanization of the news business. And the fact that, well, that's the key word. In my experience in public policy, if you can get broad agreement among a large group of people on the facts, the policy is pretty easy. But when you don't have agreement on the facts, when people are living in alternative worlds of just, A plus B equals C, you can't get anything done. You can never get agreement. And that's one of the issues that I think we have to grapple with. The other piece that makes this so difficult, and you mentioned the House, to me the most pernicious doctrine that's arisen in my adult life is the idea that compromise is a dirty word, and that you can lose your election because you're viewed as a compromiser or a problem solver. It's one thing to lose your election because you disagree with your constituents on abortion or immigration or the budget. That's one thing. But if trying to solve a problem in a bipartisan way itself will cost you your seat, which can happen in primaries, and I've had friends tell me this, that's really dangerous, because then you can't do business. There's no human enterprise that can survive without some level of compromise. And that's the danger that I see. Now, the optimistic note, I agree with Susan. I've had a lot of colleagues in the last couple of months saying, we're sick of this. In the new Congress, we're going to find a better way. And there are probably 20, 25, I'd say, easily from both sides that want to do that. And that's where we've got to try to start. The House, the House has to sort out its own issues. But if we can start to do some things on that basis, and we have from time to time, then I think we can get somewhere. Taking an agenda like the one that Susan outlined that really does have broad bipartisan support. Let's get some wins.
Senator Mitchell, I want to ask you, follow up on a point that Senator King just made, which was that it's not just the Congress that's polarized, it's the electorate. Of course, that is true. What I wonder is, from the perspective of a former leader, what is the role of acts of will by individual legislators to stand up against those forces and say, are they powerless against those forces and say, well, I can't do that because I'd get primaried and I'd lose or whatever? Or is there a point at which people say, my quality of life as a legislator, I came here to do something, solve problems, is so bad that I'm going to take the risk to stand up and push back, or is that not a realistic thing to hope for?
I don't think it's an unrealistic thing. I think it does happen. The problem is that it hasn't happened enough in recent years, and the forces operating against it are growing. The polarization of the public, all of the reasons that both Bill and others have commented on. I think it also depends upon the context in which the individual legislator lives and operates. I was very lucky when I was appointed to the Senate. Bill was the other senator. Olympia and Jacques were the two members of the House. He was the senior senator, excuse me. Now,
Does that actually make a big difference?
Absolutely. I got to go first all the time.
Psychologically for him.
Yeah.
So I was the only Democrat. There were 3 Republicans. We had our differences, but overwhelmingly, we were unanimous that we're from a small state. We had an obligation to the people of Maine that transcended any other loyalty, and we worked together. And we didn't have the kind of hostility that exists, and I think we were effective for a small delegation. And I believe that the hierarchy of values has become distorted. When I became Senate Majority Leader, the first person I called was Bob Dole. He was the Republican leader. I went to see him, and I said to him, "You've been here for 28 years. I've only been here a few years, but I know enough to know that the Senate is a very difficult place to manage and impossible to manage if we don't trust each other." And so I said, I'm here to tell you how I intend to operate towards you and ask you to do the same to me. And I set out the most basic, simple standards of fairness. He was delighted. We shook hands. To this moment, not once ever has a harsh word passed between Bob Dole and me, in public or in private. We disagreed almost every day, but we kept it on the issues, and we tried to work things out. When we couldn't, we left it for the Senate to decide, and we went on to another issue. We knew that we each had a high responsibility to the senators who elected us to be their leaders, me to the Democratic senators, he to the Republican leaders. But we also knew that we had a higher loyalty to the people of this country. And I think what you've seen now is a distortion of values in terms of loyalties. Increasingly, it is to the party and rationalized as that's best for the country, but really it isn't. So I don't think it's impossible. I think it depends upon the context of the individual people. We're very lucky to be from, and have represented, and they now represent Maine, because I think here there is a sense and a spirit of tolerance and willingness to listen to the other side and willingness to work together. I don't think that exists uniformly throughout our society. Hard to do, but it can be done. And in the end, though, I think it will depend upon the economics. A thriving economy with jobs and education and skill for all reflects itself in the political norms and mores and attitudes of elected officials.
That concludes part 1 of our very special evening with our 5 U.S. senators, but please stay tuned because the second half will be coming to you in our very next program.